Hi, my name is Sidney Dekker. I'm a professor at Griffith University where I run the Safety Science Innovation Lab, and you are in Module 2 of a short course on just culture. In this module, we're going to look at retribution as a model of creating justice in your organization and whether and how that might or might not work. In this module, we'll briefly revisit definitions. We'll look at retribution and what that means. We'll look at negligence as one category that deserves retribution. We'll look at decision trees and how that might work or not. Some protections that you might want to or need to put in place in order for retributive justice to work at all. And then have a short preview on a difference with restorative just culture. And so the next module will obviously treat restorative just culture in much more detail. So let's get started. Back to the definitions. Remember that in the previous module, a very popular way of thinking about just culture is a culture that knows a clear line and communicates a clear line between what is acceptable and unacceptable performance to your workers. In the retributive sense, such a culture would impose a fair and proportional sanction if things are unacceptable. So these are the questions that are typically asked in retribution. Which rule was broken? How bad was that breach? And what should the consequences be? All right, so which rule is broken? How bad is the breach? What should the consequences be? Here's one way in which an aviation prosecutor eerily alluded to this. He says, you have nothing to fear if you've done nothing wrong. Now, would that make you comfortable? Let's think about that. In order to increase people's comfort and trust in a system that says this to them, many organizations have embraced this idea that there are shades of retribution, that depending on how bad the breach is, the sanctions are different. And so let's talk about those shades of retribution. Here's the typical 3-shaded, and some organizations have 5 or 8 shades of retribution, and it all boils down to the same idea that the more you move along the scale, the more retribution the particular action deserves. And so on the non-sanctionable end are just the honest mistakes, right? The unintended and inadvertent slips or lapses that everybody makes. Then in the middle, with a little bit more possibility of sanction, you've got at-risk behavior. I mean, these are choices that increase risk. And so people really need some type of reminder or sanction or rap over the knuckles or whatever the sanction might be that you and your organization deems appropriate. And then at the end of the scale, there is negligence. That is a conscious disregard of unjustified risk, and that really deserves graver sanctions. These shades of retribution give some organizations the illusion that you can create justice by algorithm. Just plug in the behavior, see where it ends up, and thunk, out falls a proportional and fair retribution. But does it work that easily? When we talk about, say, negligence, then what does that actually mean? Remember, as I said in the previous module, negligence is not a human performance term, it's not a psychological term, it's a legal term. And as a legal term, it has a rather long definition, right? If we look at just this definition of negligence, all right, negligence is conduct that falls below the standard required as normal in the community. It applies to a person who fails to use a reasonable level of skill, and we could go on and on and on. You're welcome to read the whole thing if you want to pause the film. But when you get down to it, it's not really a definition. It's a whole series of judgments. When you read this definition of negligence, you have to take a position relative to all of these questions. What is the normal standard? What is that actually in your organization and in some of the professions? How far is below? A little bit below, a lot below. How is below? And what is reasonably skillful? That's an important and interesting judgment. What is reasonable care? And to what extent does knowledge of the outcome prevent us from seeing reasonable care as taken by somebody that didn't know the knowledge, that didn't know the outcome, right? What is prudent? What does that even really mean? I mean, yes, there's a dictionary definition, but how do you apply that to your seeing other people's performance? And for that matter, how do we know exactly that harm is caused by the negligent action? Because that too is a prerequisite for defining negligence. It's a huge and difficult definition that has lots of judgments, and these judgments will have to be made by someone in your organization in order to dispense justice by that sort of shades of retribution algorithm. And so many organizations understand that this is not easy, all right? And people need help, managers need help, supervisors need help, and so they resort to decision trees for guiding them through these various judgments to be made. I'm not saying this is impossible. It certainly is possible, but you have to wonder whether it creates either justice or learning, all right? Let's look at a typical decision tree. Here's one, right? Courtesy of Aliyah, which is publicly available. Now, when you look at that tree, a couple of things stand out immediately. One is, interestingly, that you start, when you look at it, you start at the red end. You are already guilty until or unless proven innocent by moving further through the tree. Now, is that how you want to approach your employees? Does that engender trust? Does that engender a climate of openness? Right? But let's look at the start. Right? Was the job was the job understood? That's the first question. Well, yeah, okay. Was the action as intended? Sure. Was the result as intended? Well, if that's all the case, then severe sanctions are called for. Let me give you an example and just test the decision tree on that. And you may have your own opinions on how this works, but let me just give you this one example and my interpretation of it. This was published in the New York Times in May 2005 about recruiting for the Army. It was in a late September when a 21-year-old, fresh from a psychiatric ward, shows up at a recruiting station. All right, the two recruiters signed him up real quick, and another said, oh no, that incident, that doesn't surprise me at all, happens all the time. He says he's been bending or breaking the rules for months, hiding police records, hiding medical histories, right? And why? Because commanders have encouraged that in order to meet the Army's recruiting quotas. All right, so there's pressure on the system. We need more recruits. The problem is no one wants to join, the recruiter says. We got to play fast and loose with the rules just to get by, all right? Others spoke of concealing mental health histories, police records. They described falsified documents, wallet-sized cheat cards, right, slipped to applicants before the military's aptitude test, and commanding officers who looked the other way. Now, let's run that recruiter, or those two recruiters, or through the decision tree. All right? Think about it. Was the job understood? Yeah, they know the job. They know that their quote has to be met as well. Their commanders know that as well. Right? Was the action as intended? Yes, we have another recruit. Was the result as intended? Yes, we have another recruit. And so severe sanctions are then called for. Now, sure, you can do that, but how much wiser is your system going to be? What learning goes on? What deeper understanding of and respect for the conditions, the systemic conditions that produce this behavior in any recruiting station any day have you gained? Extremely little. You've just sent the people out who were the symptoms of it rather than the causes. And so I have my doubts about decision trees and their ability to create justice by that sort of algorithm. What's the evidence say? Because my doubts, you shouldn't take my word for it, but there's some evidence. A 2006 survey, lots of people in hospitals, showed that those with more power in the system typically see their just culture as more just, right? So doctors and then managers in a hospital would consider the just culture system quite just. Now, those with traditionally much less power, right, allied health, nursing aides, things like that, people like that, typically consider the very same just culture much less just. In fact, they see it as a good way to get yourself fired. Or as someone told me not long ago, I have been just cultured, right? It is now a verb. I have been just cultured. I don't think that really alludes to justice at all. Or as another organization told me, right? In our organization, we have a just culture. We just fire them, right? Again, you wonder how much justice is created in any of that. Other evidence, of course, shows that if you have programs that, in the way that the decision tree suggests, blames workers for these sorts of incidents, then that drives reporting underground. Other reports suggest that organization cultures that are oriented toward punishment indeed inhibit a willingness to act on the part of employees or to come forward with safety critical evidence. So there is the literature that suggests that if you want to create both learning and justice, then this sort of retributive approach may not do it for you. But what if you insist? What if you say, look, this is the only way in which we can create accountability? All right, well, let's think about the protections that you then need to put in place, which humanity has tried for the last 2 millennia, if not 800 years at least. If you want retributive justice to work, 3 protections are really quite important. The first is an independent judge. The second is knowledge of the messy details of practice. And the third is an opportunity for appeal. What does that mean? An independent judge means that the one who runs the action through the decision tree, for example, doesn't have a stake in the outcome, right? Who is independent of the outcome. Now, if that person is the supervisor, the manager, the boss, they may well have a stake in the outcome because they don't want to be implicated in the discovery of the bad event, all right? And so they will more likely feel obliged to blame it on the worker. So they're not independent. So that's not going to be a fair judgment. You need someone who is not dependent, right? Has no stake in the outcome. Think about who that would be for various parts of your own organization, all right? Then knowledge of the messy details. This is, of course, where in the Anglo system or the common law system, the jury of peers comes in, right? But knowledge of the messy details means that you want those people who do the judging to be intimately familiar with the dirty and not necessarily well-known nuances of doing that job on a daily basis, which may be very different from how that job is written up. All right? There's always this gap between how we think work gets done and how work actually gets done. If you want to judge it fairly, you need people who have intimate knowledge of how work actually gets done at 3 a.m. on a busy ward on a Saturday, Sunday night. All right? And so, what about the opportunity for appeal? Well, what you are doing when you are judging other people is that you are assuming that they are fallible, that they can fail. But that also means that you can fail. We're all human. We can all fail in that case. All right? So that's where the opportunity for appeal comes in and is a fundamental part of any retributive justice system. Right? That is that the person who is judged to have failed can get back and say, well, hang on, I disagree. I want this looked at again. Now, that's possible in democracies and enshrined in constitutions. But does this actually work for a non-democratic hierarchical organization? Up to you to think about that, all right? Whether that would even work in your organization and how that opportunity would look. But remember this, if you want to create justice through retribution, these are the 3 protections that humanity has pretty much agreed on are important to make it work justly at all, all right? So what's next? Next is going to be restorative justice in Module 3. We'll talk about that and how that is may work out for a just culture in your organization. But I'll give you a very brief preview here. So here's a good distinction, all right? On the one hand, you will see retributive justice. So in retributive justice, an account is something that you pay or settle, all right? In restorative justice, an account is something that you tell. In retributive justice, accountability is typically backward-looking. All right, these are the words of Ginny Sharp. Beautiful characterization. Backward-looking accountability means looking back on the event, water under the bridge, who is to blame and who should be held accountable for something that has already happened. In restorative justice, accountability is much more forward-looking. Right? Who's going to do what now in order to repair the harms done and meet the obligations that arise from that? And what do we need to do to prevent recurrence of this? What understanding do we need from the whole system to foresee and prevent recurrence? So it's forward-looking accountability more than backward-looking accountability. And finally, I think retributive approaches would typically ask who is responsible for an incident, whereas restorative approaches will ask what is responsible. What is the whole package of constraints and goal conflicts and resource limitations, design issues, organizational issues that contribute to this incident having happened, right? So keep this distinction in mind and then join me to the next module. Before then, of course, as usual, you're welcome to check out sidneydekker.com books to learn more about this stuff or indeed courses and join in a graduate program on this stuff. Thank you very much. Hope to see you in Module 3.